Yes, hello everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well. And thank you again, Mr. Kurtulmuş. There were also many questions. I will also want to ask a question, but let's move on so that we have more time for the other presentations as well. So my name is Umut Erdem, and I'm an assistant professor at Doğuş University Sociology Department. And I don't want to talk too much, but again, I want to thank everybody who are putting together this conference. And I would also like to thank both the speakers, the keynote speakers and the presenters for sending us such wonderful papers. And I'm looking forward to all the presentations today. So our first speaker is going to be İsmail Demirkan from Middle Eastern Technical University. And his talk is entitled Conceptualizations of State, Role of Government and COVID-19, Responses of Philosophical Liberalism to Current Pandemic. So without further ado, you may now present Mr. Demirkan.
Hello everyone. My presentation will be probably much more simpler than most of the presentations here, but I'll do my best to present and advance as much as advanced work of philosophy. So I will start with sharing my screen. Is there any problem with the presentation at the moment?
Okay. No, we can see fine.
Okay. So I would like to give an outline of the presentation at first. My presentation mainly discusses the approaches of social and classical liberalism towards the pandemic and the policies that were implemented within the pandemic conditions. So that's why I would like to start with what this distinction means, how historically classical and social liberalism as the branches of political ideology emerged. So, and I would like to very briefly talk about their socio-historical emergent conditions. And then I will, again, very briefly give an image of how COVID-19 made an impact on the, especially political issues, how should we approach these problems. And in the last part, I will try to make a synthesis of how these different approaches, these different branches of philosophical liberalism approaches towards these issues, how do they conceptualize certain components of the problems. And I will try to make a discussion about certain terms that seems to be distinguishable in these two different branches, but approaching from more on the social side, I will try to show that these distinctions should be reconsidered because the realities change and no one lives in the times that John Locke wrote his books and so on. So then I will conclude my presentation. So the main difference between classical and social liberalism is their conceptualization of the authority and political power. In the first emergent, in the times that the classical liberalism emerged as a political ideology, mostly associated with the writings of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, or certain French philosophers, Montesquieu, Rousseau to a certain extent, and so on. It mainly considered the role of authority. If we give too much power to a certain political organ, it tends to corrupt because of too much power. It is actually a theoretical defense against the absolutist monarchies that were apparent in the European political conjuncture of the time, and it is not a surprise that the classical liberalism came out as a strong political philosophy in the times that Glorious Revolution, French Revolution, and other political events that changed the concept of absolute monarchies in the current political structures. So this is the main construction of the political ideal in classical liberalism. So it functions with the notion of limited government, because the government needs to be limited so that it doesn't possess too much power. And if it doesn't possess too much power, then it cannot have a power that is corrupted, that it cannot violate the rights and liberties of the individuals and so on. So there's an emphasis on the civil society, the certain role of governments, mainly is like the Night Watchman state in the terms of Robert Nozick. So the government should only be concerned with the security of the individuals and shouldn't be concerned with issues like education, health policies, and so on, because these roles are suited for the free markets rather than the direct state intervention. Of course, it is a very caricaturized picture of it. And then in 1929, as we all know, there's a huge economic crisis, and in the aftermath, especially the Keynes and the New Deal policies laid the basis for what we call social liberalism. So it shares certain components of the classical liberalism in that it gives individual liberty a priority. It puts emphasis on the free market principles, but the free market in this sense is not limitless, or this conceptualization of the state is not limited with the security, but it also concerns the welfare of the individuals. This is why it is also called welfare liberalism. So in the social liberalism, there is much more government intervention to economics, and there are much more roles suited for the government. So there seems to be a search for a balance between the principles of liberalism on the one hand and the problems of especially concerning inequality and the lack of necessary demand in the market and so on. And of course, historically, there's also an impact on the political conjuncture by the reality of USSR policies and Cold War and so on. But when we came to 1970s and 1980s with the impact of another economic crisis, we see a rise of neoliberalism in the form of the mixture of classical liberalism and conservative ideas and so on. But this is the main two distinction between classical and social liberalism, at least we can say that. And mostly it is on the philosophical side, the most prominent figure is John Rawls for the social liberal side, which had the impact of Kant to a certain extent. So this is the main distinction. When we came to the COVID-19, as we all unfortunately experienced it, there are many problems it caused. As far as I can see, the different people from different ideologies see the pandemic and the reactions given to it as the proof or strengthen their own arguments. For instance, when I read a Marxist interpretation of the pandemic, this interpretation speaks of how capitalism and the dynamics of the free market is damaged and cannot give response to the pandemic. But as we will see, the people from the more libertarian or classical liberal side defend that COVID-19 showed that the principle of limited government is much more necessary in today's pandemic conditions and so on. So it is ironic, in my opinion, because people from different genres think that the same situation supports their own ideological basis at this. So I will try to question these distinctions. When we look at the main problems, at least as a as a sketch, we see that there is a problem with the equal distribution of vaccines, both in national sites and international sites. In that, in national sites, the people from the lower classes seem to have much less opportunity to get the vaccine. Or in the international picture, we observe that many countries still do not have any opportunity to get the vaccines and so on. Also, another problem is that since the COVID-19 caused many economic problems, we see the increase in the numbers of the crimes that are related to the economic and political structures. And these are the main problems. So on this picture, how should we conceptualize our own philosophical side if we are looking at the issues from a liberal perspective? That is my main question, actually. So how can a classical liberal side give a response to these issues? The most apparent observations from the classical liberal side is that the governments, to the extent that they use limited government principle, they produce more efficient policies that help to solve the problems of the pandemic. But if the government policies or political policies reach out of the line that is driven by limited government, in other words, if states do not act in accordance with the limited government, it is argued, they do not produce efficient policies, rather they cause much more economic and political damages on the reality, and that is why on the long term there is a problem with these policies that are not under the concept of limited government, it is argued. To be more concrete, these policies that are included within this principle is help on research, such as the financial aid of given to the researchers in vaccine production, in tests, and so on, or the government policies such as making face masks and social distancing necessary and obligatory. These are also included within this limited government principle, it is argued, because there's a sake of life of the other individuals, and if such principles are not obligatory, it may cause on the loss of individual liberties of the other people, in the sense of there will emerge negative externalities. Also, the shutdown orders are with the same idea. Shutdown orders are included within this principle, but certain policies such as regulatory barriers or anti-price gouging laws, which are included, which are conceptualized as violation of free market principles. It is argued that these policies result in the violation of free market functioning. So when there's such violation, there occurs problems, economic problems that cause much more problems for the people, individuals, whether they are in the higher classes or lower classes, and so on. And also there's a problem with the government leaders that they failed their epistemic duty, these branches argue, because they promised to give necessary information to the citizens about the statistics of people who are affected by the pandemic, death rates, and so on. It is argued that the power given to these political leaders resulted in corruption of power, because they did not utilize their power in a way that they can inform citizens more effectively, so that they can act in a more effective way. It is argued from the classical side. But there's also a strong opposition to this side of conceptualization from the social liberal side, because especially when we consider the economic problems that were caused by the pandemic, it is observed that the countries that utilize more welfare policies seem to be more prepared for the pandemic from other countries which use more neoliberal or classical liberal policies, it is argued. In that sense, the countries such as Germany or South Korea, which are led by much more welfare policies, there seems to be a much more budget of the governments which can be utilized for the citizens and the individuals on the one hand, and on the other hand, they can put their money much more on the possible crisis that can emerge in the future. But such preparedness is not observed in the countries such as UK or USA, which are more related to the classical sides rather than the social side of liberalism. So this lack of preparedness, it is argued, results in much more death rates in these countries than they. In other words, there are death rates in these countries that could have been avoided, it is argued. So this is the main picture of these two sides of branches of liberalism in general, at least. So I want to question, as a concluding remark, I want to question whether there are that much difference between these aspects or not, because the notion of limited government is beneficial on many sides, especially concerning the corruption of power, but it is a concept that emerged in the 17th and 18th century, which were more related to the issues of these eras. And if we do not consider these structural causalities, we may miss the necessity to adapt this concept into today's needs. So I believe that this principle can still be defended with much more emphasis on the social argumentations of the social liberalism, because limited government is a principle mainly related to the maximization of individual liberties that could have been protected from certain violations. And when we consider today's reality, there are structural barriers in front of the individuals who wish to utilize their liberty. And although there seems to be no legal barrier in front of them, these structural or socio-economic realities, if not considered correctly, they can remain as barriers for the maximization of individual liberties. So my main argumentation is that the adaptation of limited government principle can be made in much more contemporary sense, in that it is not concerned only with the security of the people or only with the very limited image of the government, but more as a closer side to the social sense, in that it is also a duty of the government to utilize the necessary means for the individual liberties in socio-economic sense as well. So that is why I believe the roles, principles of justice and Kantian notion of publicity is vital in that sense, because they, at least in my view, they provide a philosophical legitimacy for adaptation of limited government principle to the social liberal conceptualization of the states. And I believe the issues that are presented by the current pandemic makes it much more possible or much more visible, because the unequity of people who the inequities that were observed with this pandemic showed that the principle of limited government cannot and must not be remain in a little box of responsibilities, but it should be conceptualized much more in a much more advanced way. I guess that's it. There's not much more thing to say for me. I can have your questions. You can see my reference list.
Yes, thank you very much. And you were right on time for finishing the talk. So if there are any questions, the floor is now open. Yes, Hussein has a question.
Thank you very much, Ismail Dennis, for this presentation. I think I will ask a clarificatory question here. So if you ask any libertarian, they would say, in any free society, we have to tolerate some more wrongs, right? I mean, if you want to get rid of those moral wrongs, you have to accept government regulation, and that's unacceptable from the point of view of freedom. Any libertarian would tell you this. Could you repeat shortly, maybe, how can you overcome this simple, basic argument? I might have missed that.
I overcome this problem by not adopting a libertarian perspective, but taking a Rawlsian perspective. But I believe the notion of limited government in reference to the problems of the pandemic is vital, not only for the pandemic, but as a philosophical notion of social liberalism. So I mainly take a Rawlsian or social liberal stance rather than a libertarian one. But I think certain concepts of the classical liberalism or libertarianism should be adapted into social liberalism as well, but should not be limited strictly with their traditional meaning. That is my main argument. Is it clear?
Umut, can I just ask a follow-up question?
Sure, sure.
Many people. So, I mean, okay, I understand that you are trying to incorporate the idea of freedom in social liberal solution that you propose, but can you just say more about how you incorporate the idea of freedom? How can you say something that will, not necessarily convince, but counter any libertarian argument there? I mean, apart from saying that you are talking from within another framework, because you are saying that you're also trying to incorporate the idea of freedom into social liberalism. Can you say more about how your scheme incorporates the idea of freedom?
I think the definition of freedom should not be limited to the only legal ones, or should not be limited only in relation to the state and individuals' interactions. Because when we see it that way, there might be social structural events that limit our freedom to act certain ways or reach certain rights. But if we do not consider them as valuable, we may miss them, and we may fail to establish a ground for these liberties to be exercised and be realized. So my main purpose is that mostly the libertarian scheme does not seem to, of course, it is too, let me put it this way. In libertarian scheme, we observe causality between the state violations on the individual rights. And there are points that they make are variable, in my own opinion, but they do not consider as a social method, let me put it this way. Their social method lacks to analyze the main causality between individual actions and their relation to their freedom. If we consider this freedom or define this freedom only in relation to the state-individual interaction, it lacks certain vital components. why social liberal take instead? Why should we take? I mean, what will be different when we take a social liberal approach? It might be asked. I argue that there are the socioeconomic conditions of the individuals in which they live in shape their way of thinking and way of action. So because of such a causality, if one person is born and raised and does not have necessary equipments to overcome these conditions, he or she cannot overcome the problems, the barriers that are presented in front of their freedom. So that is why I believe that the take of libertarians on the interaction between individual and the state is important, but it is not sufficient by only by itself. It also needs a certain causal analysis of the individual and the society as a whole. Is it clear? No. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it's very clear. Thank you. If there are, after maybe some questions, I might just follow up, but let's leave others for questions.
Thank you so much for the question, by the way.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, but I have a question that I would like to ask, and so I'm just going to ask it. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. I would just like to, it's a similar question to Hussein. I would like to hear more about the solution, and especially regarding, you mentioned Kant's notion of publicity, and even though I'm familiar with Kant, I'm not sure what you mean by that very concept. How does that concept of publicity sit in within your view of liberalism, is my question.
Actually, I was thinking much more social. The problem is that Kant is interpreted from many different perspectives in political science. For many, most of his arguments are fit in classical sense of liberalism, whereas there are others who sees him much more appropriate for social liberalism. So that's the main problem, I guess. So my main utilization of this notion is more related to the Rawlsian or Arendt's interpretation of the publicity, because when we see the political essays of Kant, the notion of publicity is presented in a way that when we consider his essay on universal idea for universal history, there's a notion that the individual is unsocial sociability. Has unsocial sociability. So I do not want to make it a Kant discussion all the way around, but I believe that the Hobbes, there's an influence of Hobbes on Kant. We can see that. But okay, let me put it in the order. I mixed all these up. So when we consider unsocial sociability, we see that Kant uses the public or publicity in order to put forward the argument that the individual is not distinct from his or her society and needs the individuals within and groups, communities within the society as well. But the legitimation for such a view in Kant had the influence of Hobbes in that Kant conceptualized nature of humankind in a much more aggressive, egoistic way when we look at, because the humans are unsocial because they want their desires to be implemented, their egos to be the best. But on the other hand, they depend on the other people. So I actually disagree with the unsocial part of his argumentation because of the Hobbes influence of Hobbes. But when we rule out this part of his conceptualization, I believe that we come with a notion of publicity that depends on the sociability of the individuals. The main reason I do not agree with the unsocial part is that I don't believe that there's a strict human nature that we can attribute to the people, whether they are egoistic in a Hobbes way or they are the pure angels by nature. It is not reality, and we see this in Locke and Rousseau as well. I don't agree with that as well. So the notion of publicity in Kant, as I understand it, or as I interpret and utilize in my own view, is that there's no strict human nature. We are all shaped and determined by the certain biological and social facts, but it is a strict fact that we depend on our society, in our community. So publicity is used in an advanced way that we should communicate with our society much more, in a way that when we consider the principle of limited government, there are times that even in social sense, things that a government cannot utilize because of the danger that is presented by the libertarians or classical liberals and so on. So the notion of publicity, in my own view, is a way that helps to help each other, or individuals' interaction, in a way that they can prevent other individuals from being non-able to utilize their freedom. I mixed many things up and put so much complex sentences. I hope
it was really good. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Yes. Are there any more questions? Let me see. I don't think so. We have a couple more minutes. So Hussein, if you wanted to continue, you can maybe ask one short follow-up.
Okay, very quick remark here. I mean, it wasn't part of your project here. You were comparing welfare states and how they succeeded. I mean, this was part of your project, not necessarily your aim, maybe, to the other governments like the US and the UK, who were following more libertarian scheme and who fared less well in the fight against COVID-19. So, and in your answer to my first question, you were saying that you do not take the concept of freedom necessarily pointing at the relationship between individual and the state. So let's now look at the relationship among the individuals in these states. Many people are anti-vaccination defenders, right? Or vaccination, what's the proper word for it? Anti-vaccination defenders, let me just put it that way. So in this type of argument, you cannot counter the idea of freedom merely by saying that, okay, I'm not interested in I do not take freedom merely as an opposition between individual and the state, because now we are arguing whether we should think of the welfare of the community or the population in general versus the free decisions of people, individuals, free decisions of individuals. So the libertarian would probably tell you, okay, look, now we have the individuals who are comparing, whose choices are compared to each other versus a more welfarist scheme which enforces or regulates vaccination in a sense. Would you still defend the welfarist state against such a libertarian argument here?
Can you elaborate your question in a more simpler way? I think I missed certain parts, because are you asking that should a welfare state defender should defend the regulations on the anti-vaccine defenders, or should we take libertarian stand on this issue? Is that your question, or?
I think I'm more or less asking that. Yes, this is what I'm more or less asking.
I'm not sure if the forcing people to be vaccinated or to utilize certain policies against anti-vaccine hesitance is let me put it this way. If we talked about the certain defenders of the classical liberal side said that we can utilize limited government's principle in a way that benefits our needs in the pandemic. So one of the examples it was given was the shutdown orders, or the social distancing and face mask obligations and so on. So these examples, I believe, in the same line with the vaccination process, because of course there are there are things that we should consider as well. There are people who cannot be vaccinated because of their health problems and so on. But apart from these little instances, if we consider vaccine hesitance as the main object of inquiry here, I think that the policies or regulations against these defenders would not be included within a regulation that violates the idea or principle of limited government. Because if we take social distancing, face masks applications, or the shutdown orders as necessary, and if we accept that they are included within the limited government principle, then also the vaccine policies are also within the same line, because they both take the idea that the actions or decisions of certain individuals cannot risk the lives of other individuals as well, so that they cannot violate other people's right to live or to be healthy and so on. It might sound a little bit too autocratic or a little inconsistent with the liberal principles, but it is open to debate. But at the moment, at least, the first answer I have is this. And I would also like to point out that I do not think that the interaction between individuals and states is not a false attitude for our definition of freedom. I just think that it is not sufficient by itself, but it is necessary, because the more power the states possess, the more risk we have for the violation of individual liberties. I think that is correct, and I think that should be basis of our conceptualization of freedom. But I'm just arguing that it is not sufficient. It is not enough by itself. We need more components on the definition of freedom. Just to be clear.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Great questions and great answers. I shouldn't have said great questions because I was the second person asking questions, but anyways. Okay, thank you very much, İsmail Demirkan,